Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with my unit tier list for the Dark Elves in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Like with the High Elves, this is a tier list that people have asked me to do. And like with the High Elves, I feel it's kind of useless to do a tier list because it is very clear some units are much better than others in a Dark Elven campaign. At least no one's asked me to do a tier list on the Wood Elves yet. To be fair though, unlike the High Elves, Dark Elves have a much better situation with recruitment. See, that's one of the reasons the High Elf unit tier list ended up the way it is, because it is a question of tier availability, it is a question of the High Elves needing multiple structures to make that economy work. It does work if you get multiple buildings and settlements to really unlock the economic potential. For Dark Elves, the situation is different. They don't need to get 4 different buildings or 3 different buildings in a settlement, like a control building, an economic building, then either a tariff building or an elven court building to unlock the full economic potential. Dark Elves have a lot of money and a great deal of diplomatic flexibility. The only race that you will certainly have to fight in a Dark Elven campaign are High Elves. Everyone else you can kind of pick and choose, besides of course victory conditions in a campaign. But the problem with Dark Elves, even though they have a lot more flexibility in terms of recruiting units, be it Black Arks or regular settlements, the problem they have is that a lot of their higher tier units are just kind of not worth recruiting in many ways. I mean, there's obviously monstrous units like Black Dragons that are worth recruiting, but if you're thinking about higher tier infantry or if you're thinking about cavalry, that is where things get very questionable. So with that in mind, let's start with the humble Dreadspears. I'm going to say that they're an A tier unit. They're not an S tier unit like High Elven Spearmen. One, they're not as good as High Elven Spearmen in their principal role, which is holding the line. For the record, they are pretty good at it. Their durability is good, their charge reflection, their anti-large, their availability of recruitment from every single settlement. But they're just not on that same level. Another reason I'm putting them in A tier as opposed to S tier is because with High Elves, you don't really have a great deal of options early on in a campaign. And you're limited by growth and just settlement structures. Whereas with Dark Elves, you do have that kind of flexibility. Still a very good line holder, and I would recommend recruiting these in every single Dark Elven campaign. But all the same, just not as good as the High Elf Spearmen, but still a very solid early game line holder. Charge reflection, charge benefits against cavalry, charge defense against cavalry, or large units, anti-large benefits, really solid unit. Then we have Bleak Swords, an early game sword and shield infantry that is completely pointless. They're outclassed by other units available at their same tier. Like, if you're looking to deal with enemy infantry and have that kind of damage capability, you get Dark Shards. If you're looking to hold a line, you get Dreadspears. There's almost no reason to recruit Bleak Swords in a campaign. They are cheap, but there's other options that are much better and worth recruiting far more than Bleak Swords. Then we have Dark Shards and Dark Shards with shields. So I think regular Dark Shards are a D tier unit. They're not useless, but Dark Shards with shields are an S tier unit. So let me explain. Dark Shards are more limited in range than High Elven archers. The one problem with regular Dark Shards versus Dark Shards with shields is obviously the shield itself. The shield itself makes Dark Shards with shields a far more durable unit in general. Whereas Dark Shards without shields, sure, they still have the same damage potential, but because of their more limited range against High Elves and other factions, they're just not usually worth recruiting. On top of that, due to the fact that Dark Elves have a good amount of growth, instant construction available in their campaigns as well, and can recruit units from Black Arks, you're never in a situation where, or you're very rarely in a situation, and typically only at the beginning of campaigns, where you're kind of forced to recruit Dark Shards. But the moment you can recruit Dark Shards with shields, there's no reason whatsoever to recruit regular Dark Shards. Even if you're dealing with melee-only factions, there's still no reason to recruit Dark Shards. Because even melee only faction or melee-centric factions do have some range capability. Even if it's only going to be the towers and the settlement, it's still going to be there. So what is the value proposition? Sure, they're cheaper, but they're not worth it. And besides, Dark Elves can get the tremendous amount of money very quickly. But yeah, Dark Shards, good armor piercing, more limited range, but good survivability against ranged units. Obviously not good at all in melee, but still pretty decent survivability overall. Very much worth recruiting in a campaign. Harpies, F tier unit, like a flying unit. There's some capability over there with regards to harassing enemy artillery, harassing enemy range units potentially, but their survivability is so pathetic that they're genuinely not worth recruiting as a unit. Harpies in general, or these kind of fast-moving flying units with low durability, low HP, are usually not worth recruiting, or recruiting in only very limited quantities. And if we want to make a comparison, it might be worth recruiting Chaos Furies in a Chaos campaign, right? Because they can distract enemy artillery so your melee units can close the gap. But when you have the range capability and magic capability that the Dark Elves have, and a significant amount of hero capability, because Dark Elves have a great deal of hero capacity available to them, Harpies certainly lose whatever value proposition they have in a campaign. Feral Manticore, also an F tier unit. If it wasn't Feral, it would be higher. But the control proposition on this unit is very easy to lose control. It dies relatively quickly. It can give you some kind of maneuverability on the battlefield, but it is that lack of control that damns this unit. It's very easy to lose control of this unit and have it do whatever it wants. Again, if we could guarantee that control in a battle with Manticores, they would be much higher tier as a unit, but as things currently stand, they're just flat out not worth recruiting in a Dark Elf campaign. Then we have Black Ark Corsairs and Black Ark Corsairs with handbows. So handbows, pretty damn useless unit. Their range capability is not great. Their melee capability is weaker than regular Black Arks. So there's pretty much no reason whatsoever to recruit Black Ark Corsairs with handbows. There is, however, plenty of reason to recruit Black Ark Corsairs. Their melee capability early on is really good. They're good at surviving. They have a good amount of armor. They have a good amount of durability. And they'll usually beat most other units in melee. With the exception of course, things like Chaos Warriors or Bloodletters. But then, again, when you're dealing with Bloodletters, you have Dark Shards. When you're dealing with Chaos Warriors, unless it's Chaos Warriors with great weapons, you can trade fairly well with them. And against other races, and I do mention the Chaos Warriors for a reason, because against the melee units available to every other race in the game, these guys will destroy them. On top of that, these are not a tier 3 unit. Sure, they can only be recruited from tier 3 in a regular settlement, but you can fairly quickly in any Dark Elven campaign get access to a Black Ark and start spamming these guys through Black Arks, which replace your global recruitment. So absolutely worth recruiting as a unit. Good value proposition. Their upkeep might be a bit higher, but that's where Black Arks with their lower upkeep benefit really come into play, because you can recruit an entire stack of units and even move them around with a Black Ark, and then when you're ready to go a bit inland, you just transfer them to an army. On top of that, Black Arks also have the ability of attacking ports, so you can just have entire armies of Black Arks just harassing the enemy coastline, taking territory, and being very difficult to dislodge from that kind of position. So it's a tier 3 unit that you can recruit at tier 1. That already is a significant power level. The only race that has a greater power level is Khorne, with Chaos Warriors of Khorne. But even then, there's plenty of reasons to recruit Black Arks, especially when you combine it with Dark Elven magic, line holding, range capability, just a fantastic combination of melee and range that Dark Elves have available very early on in their campaign. Then we have Dark Riders, all the versions of Dark Riders. So all the versions of Dark Riders, I'm going to say it very clearly, all the versions of Dark Riders are F-tier units. With perhaps the exception of the Dark Riders repeater crossbows, but even then, not really. The only value proposition of repeater crossbows is that you can harass an enemy, but they lack the range or damage capability to be useful in that role, and they also lack any kind of real survivability. So Dark Riders are a fast-moving light cav unit, but they're worse than Illyrian Reavers for the High Elves. They're flat, not worth recruiting. Shielded, unshielded, especially the unshielded version. And repeater crossbows might give you that kind of harassment capability, but again, just really not worth getting. If you want a unit to chase down the enemy, which might be the value proposition we're talking about with Dark Riders, there is potentially a better option available for the Dark Elves in their campaigns. Though really, with regards to cavalry, I would probably use allied recruitment, because Dark Elves have a good amount of diplomatic capability, so I would just not bother recruiting most, if not all, of the Dark Elf cavalry options, and instead rely on allied recruitment to help fill those gaps in an army roster. Then we have Doomfire Warlocks, also an F-tier unit. As I said, cavalry options for the Dark Elves are severely lacking for the most part, with the exception of a couple of monstrous cavalry options, but even then there's some discussion on that subject. Doomfire Warlocks can do a decent amount of damage. They can do a decent amount of harassment capability. But one, they're reasonably expensive, annoying to recruit in a campaign. See, one of the benefits of Black Ark Corsairs, Dread Spears, Dark Shards with Shields, hell, even Bleak Swords, is that you can recruit them from the same building, and you want to build that building anyway. Even if you don't care about any of those units, you would construct that anyway, because it gives you the ability of getting a hero, the Masters. So it increases hero capacity at tier 2. That gives that building a huge amount of value proposition. Whereas with the cavalry chain that these guys come from, you're getting Dark Riders and Doomfire Warlocks. That already lessens the value proposition. So there's cost, there's annoyance and recruitment capabilities. Even with Black Arks, the building these guys come from is probably one of the lowest priorities in a Black Ark. Like, you're better off constructing anything else with that than getting these guys. They can chase down units. They're pretty good at chasing down units. But that's realistically the only role. They're not good at fighting and engaging an army in a battle. They're not good as a cavalry unit. They don't have the survivability. They have the speed, but they don't have the survivability. Damage-wise, it's kind of a burst damage, glass cannon type unit. So even from that perspective, I find them a bit questionable. They can do a bit of damage, but not necessarily throughout the course of a longer battle. So I find Doomfire Warlocks to be a very questionable unit to recruit in general, or to even get their recruitment structure in general. Then we have Shades. So regular Shades, Shades with dual weapons, and Shades with, you do have these options, like, Shades dual weapons, two-handed weapons, and regular Shades. Here's my view on Shades. In terms of range capability, if you're fighting other rage factions, okay, so in terms of pure range damage, they're roughly on par with Dark Shards, though they can have more mobility in Dark Shards, they can get some good upgrades, they can outrange them. In terms of pure damage, roughly about the same. The problem with these guys is they're less survivable than Dark Shards against enemy range factions. So if you're fighting High Elves, and you will be fighting High Elves in every single Dark Elven campaign, because that is your long-term campaign objective, I find Shades to be very questionable against High Elves. They do have, mobility on the battlefield, stealth on the battlefield, but a line of High Elven archers can do a significant amount of damage to these guys very, very quickly. These are not Shadow Walkers or Shadow Warriors, and even those units are very questionable for the High Elves. Where Shades are good is if you're dealing with Chaos factions or melee-focused factions, because obviously Dark Shards don't have great melee capability. They have good range capability, but if someone closes the melee gap, Dark Shards are going to get slaughtered. Shades are kind of like Streltsy or Armor Corsairs. They can do a good amount of range damage, or probably the Streltsy comparison, or maybe the Ice Guard comparison. They can do a decent amount or good amount of range damage, but their true capability is from that hybrid role. Now, the two-handed version of Shades, especially, are going to be really good at dealing with Chaos factions. One of the reasons they're one of your best options at dealing with melee-centric factions is that your dedicated, big, heavy melee hitters are not worth recruiting. So Shades, in general, are worth it more than Argonef Executioners or Blackguard of Nagrod if you're dealing with melee-centric factions. But it's a situational thing. It depends on who you're dealing with. Dark Shards are always useful. Black Ark Corsairs are always useful. Dread Spears are almost always useful. Two-handed Shades are useful in that context. Outside of that context, I would personally just recruit more Black Ark Corsairs and Dark Shards and get more armies. The cost of Shades is not something to scoff at, even for the Dark Elves with their significant economy. And again, given the focus of High Elves, you may not need them whatsoever. I understand why people find them appealing, because having a unit that can be both good in range and good in melee is certainly a very appealing option to a lot of players. I understand that. But the value proposition from my point of view with Shades is not worth it in most situations. And even when you're dealing with melee-centric factions, it's only the two-handed version of Shades that is really, really worth recruiting. Because one of the problems, because like the regular ones, like Black Ark Corsairs are worth it more compared to the regular Shades or dual weapon Shades. Sure, they don't have that melee capability, but they have a lot more survivability in melee, especially. But the two-handed version makes up for a capability that Black Ark Corsairs don't have, which is armor-piercing melee capability. They have an anti-infantry benefit, but they're obviously lacking in that respect. Then we have Reaper Bolt Throwers, D tier. The sole reason I'm not putting this in a tier like a Gold Claw Bolt Thrower is because, one, you can guarantee recruitment of these guys for a building that you want to construct anyway. So that's a really good option for the Dark Elves. So you get this through your regular military barracks. That's a good option. You do need an artillery capability to deal with sieges. And unlike elves who have long-range archers, you don't have long-range options necessarily as the Dark Elves. This is where Reaper Bolt Throwers do come in, providing you that long-range capability that you may be lacking elsewhere, and being able to lure the enemy into attacking an entrenched position covered by Dark Shards, Black Arcs, Dread Spears, and all that kind of stuff, right? Forcing the enemy into an unfavorable engagement. So yeah, between the siege situation, their availability of recruitment, the usefulness they have in battle, they're a D tier unit. Here's the thing though, about Reaper Bolt Throwers. The artillery options you can get through allied recruitment are just flat out better. And remember what I said, Dark Elves have a great deal of diplomatic capability. They can make deals and make it work very well with virtually every single race on the campaign map, be it Order aligned or Chaos aligned, it doesn't matter. They can make that work. The only ones that can't make it work are High Elves, but everyone else, including the Empire, Bretonia, Dwarves, they can make it work. Can be a bit complicated with the Dwarves, but if you're playing Malek, if I can tell you one thing for a fact, you can play that entire campaign in ally Grumbrindle very quickly. Guess what Grumbrindle's gonna provide you very quickly in his campaign, which is artillery. So that's the reason they're D tier. Like, if we didn't have allied recruitment, I'd probably put them higher. But we do have allied recruitment. We do have a huge amount of options that are just flat out better than these guys. But if you don't have that kind of capability in your campaign, yeah. But let's consider every single Dark Elf campaign just for a second here. If you're playing Malek, if I mentioned Grumbrindle, right? But it's not just Grumbrindle. You could ally Katep, for instance, in a campaign like that. If you're playing Malekith, you could ally Katep if you want to go with more lower reasonable options. And Katep can give you much better artillery. It can be a bit annoying recruiting from Tomb Kings, allied recruitment from Tomb Kings, but still. You do have Grombrindle, you do have Katep as options. If you're playing Morathi, you could ally Ostankya. Sure. You know, little Groms, maybe a bit annoying to be recruited. But realistically, you can also just hop on a boat and go to Cathay and get access to Skaven or Cathayan artillery. If you're playing Lokir, you got either the Skaven or Cathayan artillery. If you're playing Rakarth, you have the Skaven and also Cathay not too far away from you. If you're playing Malice Darkblade, you have Dwarves available to you or Chaos. Warriors of Chaos, you know, freaking Hell Cannons, maybe. A bit questionable on that subject. Still, you do have options, right? That's my point. In every single Dark Elven campaign, you have someone close enough that offers you much better artillery options than these things are. So it's absolutely not worth it. And I mean things early. Later on, it doesn't matter where you start or what's close enough to you, but very early on. Then we have Harganeth Executioners, F tier unit. I'm sorry, like, I cannot justify this unit. It's a two-handed melee infantry unit that's got a good amount of armor piercing. Yeah, what do Shades with Grey weapons do? That is exactly what they provide. Combined with the range capability, these units are worthless. These units are worth recruiting if you need that melee capability. And similar with Blackguard of Nagron, though I'm going to put Blackguard of Nagron a bit higher on D tier, simply because of their anti-large capability. So if you're dealing with a lot of enemy fast movers, cavalry, you might want to get some Blackguard of Nagron, though most of the time they're kind of meaningless compared to Dread Spears. But if you're dealing with, you know, rogue idols, trolls, all that kind of stuff, you may want to get some Blackguard of Nagron. But it's a very situational thing. Funnily enough, I think Rakarth actually gets the most value out of these because, you know, lizardmen. But all the same, very questionable to recruit Blackguard or Harganeth Executioners in a Dark Elven campaign. Next up, we have Charybdises and War Hydras. They're not C tier, by the way, just gonna make that very clear. So, where would I rank these units? Well, they have different roles. The Charybdis is a monster killer, a single entity monster killer. It has a bonus versus a large, it has poison attacks, it has a good amount of survivability both in melee and against ranged. It's kind of like an Arachnarok spider for the Dark Elves, if you want to make that comparison. But it is good against Arachnarok spiders. It would flat out win that battle. So for what it's offering, in terms of like that kind of melee capability against single entities, I would say they're an A tier unit. Because you might struggle getting that capability. Sure, you have Blackguard and Nagron, but as I said, they're not worth recruiting in a campaign. They're annoying to recruit. And mind you, Charybdises are not horrible against other things as well. Like, you can have them soak a lot of range damage, especially if you're dealing with High Elves, because, you know, High Elves lack armor piercing unless you're talking about Sisters. So they can soak up a good amount of range damage. They can deal with dragons. They can deal with single entities. Whatever large unit you're throwing against them, including lords, on mounts that are large, the Charybdis is a fairly strong unit from that perspective. War Hydras, I'm going to say that War Hydras are a B tier unit. Not because they're terrible, but they're more oriented at dealing with chunks of enemy units. But they're on the ground. So they're the equivalent, they serve an equivalent role like, say, Moondragons for the High Elves, but they don't have the kind of flexibility as Moondragons, and certainly they don't compare to Star Dragons. So from my point of view with regards to War Hydras, I think Charybdises are worth recruiting. I don't necessarily think War Hydras are worth recruiting, because you have plenty of damage capability against infantry, melee infantry, like range capability, melee, your own melee capability. The Hydra is pretty good in that role, but you also have plenty of good options as well, including Black Dragons. So Black Dragons, I think, are an A tier unit if you do bother recruiting them. The problem is getting access to them in the first place, to be sure. But one of the things I would mention is, again, Dark Elves have a much better recruitment situation than High Elves, and in fact have a much better recruitment situation than most other races. Partly because in regular settlements, they have that growth situation, but sure, regular settlement recruitment can suck because of limited recruitment slots and all that. But Black Arks, right? Black Arks are dedicated for unit recruitment. So that means you can access a lot more units far more quickly in a Dark Elf campaign than you would in other campaigns. Like in certain campaigns, it is annoying unlocking single entities simply because, tier requirements and all that. Well, in regular settlements, again, Dark Elves have a significant amount of growth and instant construction, both of which, by the way, allow you to get to high tiers very quickly if you want to. So that is one advantage the Dark Elves have. 2, they also have a really strong economy to be able to access these. And, well, having a flying flying monster that can also, do breath attacks is pretty useful. In a way that I would say even Star Dragons are not necessarily so useful for High Elves, because it's High Elves, by the point you can recruit Star Dragons, campaign's kind of over and it's kind of redundant and you just want to have more armies to deal with a larger empire, whereas with Dark Elves, well, you have a significant economic benefit because you can literally have armies roaming around the campaign map in Black Arks with a significant upkeep benefit, so cost is less of an issue. That's one of the things to be said about Dark Elves. It's not that they can just recruit a bunch of higher tier units, though to be fair, most of their higher tier units are bloody useless, but rather the fact that Dark Elves can afford to maintain them cheaper than most other factions because of that Black Ark upkeep benefit. That's one of the reasons Black Dragons are one of the few single entities that I am going to rank in these tier lists as high as I am. It's not just like the unit itself, it's, upkeep, availability of recruitment, all that kind of stuff that does play a fairly major role from my perspective with regards to their tier placement. I don't need to explain what is good about Black Dragons. Big single entity that's really powerful in melee, breath attacks, fairly survivable, fairly good at getting the job done. Then we have Medusa. I would say regular Medusa are a C tier unit for Dark Elves. Decent enough range capability for a big single entity, to be sure. Like, Medusa are not a melee unit. They're a range unit, and you should treat them as a range unit, a range single entity. Gets the job done, more dedicated at dealing with units and obviously dueling out with artillery, but you might be surprised at how capable Medusa are at just being a genuine annoyance for anyone to deal with. Because they're decently durable from that perspective, fairly easy enough to acquire as a single entity. But there's a reason I'm putting them B tier, because you do have the Shrine option. The Shrine option is just better. The one thing I do have against Medusa, as far as an artillery unit goes, if you want to consider that, and I probably would treat them that, they do have the same issue that a lot of single entity artillery options have, including Cast Dwarf ones, which is vulnerability to other artillery options. Though Medusa are generally better at surviving against other artillery than those kind of single entities. The damage can be maybe a bit too focused, and you might just be overkilling a particular target, so that can be an issue. Their melee capability, not necessarily that great, though you will be getting the structure they come from in every single campaign. There's a bit of annoyance with recruitment, though, and not necessarily because of cost, but usually you get the structure these things come from in land settlements. You don't get them on Black Arks. Like on Black Arks, you have other priorities, right? The reason you get the structure is for mage capacity. Well, Black Arks have a great deal of recruitment options, but you usually don't bother with that structure in them because it's not increasing the capacity of heroes. So you get them in land settlements. And in land settlements, limited recruitment slots does end up hurting these units quite a bit. There's just flat out bigger priorities in Dark Elf land settlements than recruiting Medusa. Like, I'd rather, with Black Arks, I'd focus on obviously getting the basic barracks, so I wouldn't bother with recruiting the basic barracks units, and then I would bother with Shades, potentially, or Black Dragons, War Hydra, all that from regular settlements, which I can grow very quickly and quicker than Black Arks. So it's a question, and typically speaking, in Lance Elements, you're mostly focusing on increasing your hero capacity than recruitment. So it's just a bit of limitations with respect to that, from my point of view. And also, the unit does have a decent capability, but it's not extraordinary capability from my perspective. Then we have chariots, Scourge Runner Chariot and Cold One Chariots. So here's the thing, and this is why I discount Dark Riders with crossbows, because you have Scourge Runners and you have Cold One Chariots. Cold One Chariots and Scourge Runner Chariots, if you're looking for a unit that is good at flanking the enemy, these guys are decent at the job. Not the best unit you can get for the job. Again, you're probably better off if you're looking for shock cavalry options, you're better off looking at allied recruitment. You don't really have a shock cavalry option. You do have one, I'll be fair, but as far as cavalry units go, they're not great. But here's the thing about Scourge Runners and Cold One Chariots. They're good at harassing the enemy and forcing them to engage your well-prepared line. Scourge Runners are fairly easy to acquire. Cold One Chariots are, generally speaking, better units. But both of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, but they have the same role. Just, different costs, different tier requirements, but roughly the same role. Later on in a campaign, you'd probably get Cold One Chariots exclusively. It is useful to have these units in certain situations. In other situations, you don't need them. And as far as chariots go, by the way, in Warhammer 3, these are really good chariots. Like other chariots, I would put F tier. The reason is chariots have pathfinding issues. They have, they get stuck in things. These are not war sleds, though. Like even Cold One Chariots, let alone Scourge Runners, they're not good enough in melee to do the same job as war sleds. See, the reason war sleds are a fantastic fucking chariot unit is not only do they have that ranged skirmishing capability, not only do they have the capability of flanking the enemy and doing a good amount of damage, which certainly Cold One Chariots can do, but they also have the capability of just throwing them in the middle of a settlement and they'll kill everything in sight. Dark Elf Chariots don't quite have that same kind of capability, so their usage is more limited. They're useful at harassing the enemy, skirmishing, flanking, all that, but they're not a stand-up and fight type unit, and that is their weakness from my perspective in a campaign. Then we get Witch Elves. Don't bother with Witch Elves. They're just completely pointless as a unit, a bit annoying to recruit. And if you want a unit that has the same kind of capability as Witch Elves, you can go for Sisters of Slaughter. And I should probably shrink that image of Morathi a bit there. There we go. So yeah, Witch Elves, glass cannon unit, can be easy to recruit, can be very, very easy to lose them. And if you're fighting melee-focused factions, they can be useful. But then again, if you're fighting melee-focused factions, Shades are right there. And they're flat-out better than Witch Elves. They might not do the same kind of damage in melee, but they're far more freaking durable. The only situation in which you might even consider recruiting Witch Elves is Halibron. But in that situation, Sisters of Slaughter exist. Hello, better unit flat-out all around. They're both very glass cannon unit, but Sisters of Slaughter I just find to be better at that kind of job. So if you're looking for that kind of glass cannon, high damage, low durability units, Sisters are better than regular Witch Elves, from my point of view, in a Dark Elven campaign. And finally, we have the heavy cavalry of the Dark Elves. Cold One Knights and Cold One Dread Knights. Cold One Dread Knights are an F tier unit. Easily an F tier unit. Let me explain. They're an elite cavalry unit that requires tier 5 to recruit. That's already something that's going to discount them, because they're trying to be the equivalent of Grail Guardians, and it's like Grail Guardians would just laugh in their faces and then proceed to slaughter them. They're not good enough as a heavy cavalry. Their tier requirement, their cost of units, like at the same tier you can get these, you can get Black Dragons. In the previous tiers you can get better units. So if you're looking for a faster moving unit that can get stuck in a fight and survive, Hydras exist. Carapaces exist, Black Dragons exist. Hell, I'd rather take Medusa or Chariots than these guys. There's almost no value proposition in getting Cold One Dreadnoughts. Now, Cold Ones, that's a different discussion, because they're monstrous cavalry. They're pretty fast, all things considered. Reasonably fast. Not the best stats overall, but they're anti-large. So while Charybdis will destroy cavalry, obviously the speed consideration is something important with regards to cavalry. Any unit that can match them speed, in terms of speed, they'll probably win against those kind of cavalry units. Units that are slower would probably beat them in a fair fight, but they can outrun them. So from my point of view, with respect to Cold One Knights, they can be worth it, specifically to deal with enemy cavalry. If you're looking at recruiting this unit to deal with enemy infantry, Cold One Knights, Cold One Chariots do exist, but you do have plenty of anti-infantry options. That's the reason they're a lower tier from that perspective. But still, I would view Cold One Chariots as a skirmishing unit to harass the enemy, get them to engage in unfavorable situations, whereas Cold One Knights are your dedicated anti-cav that are recruited at the same tier as Cold One Chariots. So they're useful. Also, the building in general is worth getting once you get to tier 4, local recruitment capacity and all that kind of stuff. So it is worth getting it for that perspective. Though whether or not you need these guys, it's going to depend on the situation you're dealing with in a campaign. Personally, I think you would probably only really bother if you're, dealing with masses of Horn Cavalry or Bretonnia, and Bretonnia has managed to get to those higher tier of units, but even then Bretonnian Cavalry would probably smack you in the face pretty hard. Still, they have at least some usage on the battlefield, unlike Cold One Dread Knights. So that is my unit tier list for the Dark Elves. As I said, Dark Elves have a good amount of availability in terms of recruiting a lot of units, because of their economy works, the way Black Arcs work, but a lot of units just are not worth recruiting. Maybe I should have put Shades in S tier, Shades with Grey Weapons at least, because they are pretty useful. Maybe I really should put these Shades. Yeah, I think I'm going to do so. Though they are situational, you don't necessarily want to recruit them in every situation. But when you do want to recruit them, they're incredibly useful if you're dealing with heavily armored enemies that might just win in melee against Black Ark Corsairs. So they have that particular usage. Like, these guys are your quote-unquote heavy infantry. They're not heavy infantry. Your heavy infantry is bloody useless in a Dark Elven campaign. But that's where I stand. Let me know what you guys think. Costin, signing out.